So, hello all and welcome to the Fintech Finance Virtual Arena. Today, I'd like to host you from the other Fintech Finance Virtual Arena flat, my own. As you can tell, we are still in lockdown. And in the virtual arena, we've been discovering the biggest opportunities and challenges in the financial industry. And today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into payments, where we'll be discussing the regulation SCA, its impact on financial services, innovation, and even the retail industry when it comes to e-commerce. So, stronger customer authentication, or SCA, is a requirement of the EU revised directive on payment services PSD2. And it requires payment service providers within the European Economic Area to follow that. Now, this requirement ensures that electronic payments are performed with multi-factor authentication to increase the security of electronic payments. Now, with that all in mind, I'd like to introduce my esteemed guests who are joining me today on the virtual arena to get their input when it comes to SCA. So if I could have Andy up first, could you give me a little introduction about yourself, please?
Yeah, hi there, Doug. So Andy Ramsden from G&D, Giesecke and Devrient. So we're based in Germany. I work out the UK office and responsible for mobile authentication and identity management. So we work closely with financial institutions in the digital space, really. So our traditional background is in banking and bank cards and SIM cards, but increasingly more in the digital arena these days.
Brilliant. And Paul?
I'm delighted to join the venue, and I'm the chairman of Vendorcom. Vendorcom's a forum and a hub that brings together the key players in the European payments ecosystem. So Vendorcom's been going since 2003 and covers all areas of payments, predominantly on the merchant payments arena, and so everything to do with cards, even checks, and surprising to some, cash. So in the last few years, strong customer authentication has been a major area that we've been focused in on.
Definitely, it seems to have really caught the imagination of quite a few people. In fact, I actually went over to the EBA last year to talk with one of the key policymakers behind it and got some really interesting insight behind that. So make sure you check that at www.fintech.finance. But obviously we can't start one of these virtual arenas without talking about the reason why we aren't all in a studio together. We're actually here in the virtual arena. So, can I ask you guys, Andy, Paul, what have you been doing in your spare time or while you've been in lockdown at your houses?
Well, as you can see, I've been shaving my hair off. So I did a challenge for the NHS. I was so frustrated with my long hair that I decided to raise a bit of money for charity and shave the whole thing off. So this is 2 weeks of growth now. So
congratulations. I mean, that's certainly more drastic than anything I've done. Paul, have you done anything as incredible as that?
Well, I might say that I'd cut all mine off and done, but I'm afraid this is how I looked even before coronavirus hit. But I've been having a similar sort of thing, but not self-inflicted. The 2.6 challenge that took place at the weekend, I managed to persuade my wife to get involved in that. And it actually might surprise you that she offered that I could cut her hair on a #1 clipper setting, which is the nearest you can get to 2.6 millimeters. So probably doesn't look all that different to what Andy looks now. So that was one of the things I've been getting involved with. But you mentioned spare time. Actually, since this has started, there's been almost no spare time. I've been working 15 or 18-hour days at the moment because just responding to the situation has brought more opportunity, more challenges, and so there's not much spare time. When I do find a little bit of spare time, I just like to get outdoors, and we're fortunate that I'm living just north of Oxford, so nice village life, so a lot more pleasant than perhaps some folks are having to deal with right now.
Can you tell me a bit more about the Vendorcom community? What it is, what you provide your members, and really how they interact in the payments ecosystem?
Yeah, so Vendorcom, as I mentioned before, is a forum and a hub that brings together the key players in the European payments scene. And it's largely got members like the card schemes, acquirers, processors, gateways, and increasingly in recent years, the merchant community as formal members. We've, in the early stages as a vendor community, we actually didn't include the end customer in the form of the merchant, partly because I wanted Vendorcom to be a platform where it wasn't an overt business development arena. It was much more about how solutions providers informed themselves and worked together, because the basic tenet of Vendorcom was to provide a platform to promote collaboration, to drive innovation. And it's still very much about that, but the merchants have flocked to Vendorcom because they know that it's a really solid area to get authoritative, independent, pragmatic advice on the things that are truly happening, rather than the hype that you often get whipped up in and around our very exciting and vibrant sector. So it's been going since 2003. We've picked up on a whole host of different payments issues. We run our future payments conferences 3 times a year, and then a series of about just over 30 payments forums on different topical issues, different merchant market vertical areas. So very vibrant community, very much about bringing peers together, connecting them with each other, connecting them with the issues, and connecting them with where the market is going.
Excellent. Well, I'll be really interested to hear your point of view on how the merchants are looking at SCA. Now, Andy, G&D's, you've been in the payments industry literally for over 100 years. Not you personally, but what's it like being part of an organization with that significant payment lineage?
Yeah, you're right. I think over 160 years, starting in Leipzig with printing and early banknotes. And I think I saw the other day Annie Hall, where Woody Allen makes a quote where he says that the secret of a successful marriage is, he likens it to sharks, that you have to keep moving forward, and that's how he's successful. And I think for a business, it's the same principle really. For G&D, they have to evolve and innovate, otherwise you die. So you're only ever as good as the last thing you did. So and that's kind of what I like about G&D is, we've done the currency. We still do a large part of our revenue comes from the currency business, and then bank cards and SIM cards and now eSIMs. But increasingly, it's this area of digitization and solutions in this space, really doing what we've always done, but taking it into a completely different arena with completely different challenges. Authentication being a typical one, where these problems never used to exist when you met face to face. So yeah, it's a huge change, and we continue to evolve. And I think the secret of our success is only going to be as good as our ability to innovate and change. And that's what keeps me excited and motivated. And no more so than in this time now with the pandemic, really, where it's really shining the light on doing things remotely and the digital channel. So that's great, and it's exciting and opening up new opportunities in new areas such as health and all sorts of things we'd never really worried about before, but we do now, like sharing patient data, proving you're a key worker, and so on and so on.
Obviously, I gave the very brief Wikipedia intro to SCA, but Paul, for our listeners and viewers, what actually is SCA?
Well, I think your definition was actually very strong. It basically covered the key principles of what strong customer authentication is really about. So strong customer authentication, or to give it its full name, the regulatory technical standards for strong customer authentication, is it's part of a European directive, the Second Payment Services Directive. And that was driven by the European Banking Authority. And actually it goes back, I'd use the main sort of benchmark timeline as August 2016, and I know there were some discussions about it before then, but the European Banking Authority first produced a consultation on this in August 2016, and really from then things started moving forward, slowly to start with, but it's basically saying that electronic transactions have to be two-factor authenticated, and that basically means that two elements from three different areas need to be used. So the three elements, three areas are often referred to as something you know, something you have, or something you are. And so we're very familiar with that in relation to chip and pin. That is essentially a two-factor authenticated style transaction. And it's 14 years since we locked down face-to-face fraud. And so because we were starting to see fraud emerging to a, frankly, quite a catastrophic level in e-commerce, mobile and remote transactions, then the European Banking Authority decided that they needed to act and proposed the RTS for SCA. So it's basically something that anyone that was accepting and processing payments in mobile, remote and e-commerce transactions would have to comply with. And the original date for compliance for that was 14th of September last year, 2019, after it had been put into regulation in March 2018. So it was firmed up by March 2018, and with the standard 18-month roll-in period to September 2019. So that's basically in its highest sort of level, but there's a lot more detail, and I often say the devil is in the detail.
Obviously, I think one of the clear things we actually need to think about when we think about SCA is why did the EBA step in? Why did we get this regulation from PSD2? And what's it really going to mean in terms of its impetus? Why did it come about? Andy, can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, we're all very aware of this sort of explosion in the use of mobiles and smartphones and digital. But just looking back in my lifetime as a student, the only place I used to authenticate myself was at an ATM machine to get cash out. Right, there was really no other place to do that. But in the 90s, we got chip and pin, and we used to authenticate at the point of sale at the pin pad. And then we started to go online and use desktop to do sort of web banking, and that was really the birth of usernames and passwords. And for 10 or 20 years, this just it started off okay, and then just became completely unmanageable. Because we're all using the same passwords, we're lazy, and it really was starting to fail. And you look ahead now, we're now using the mobile and our tablets for everything. And in the future with IoT, it's just going to be another order of magnitude when you've got, I still don't believe fridges are necessarily going to make payments, but the idea that fridges and toasters and light bulbs and all these things, because there is no physical presence, they all require authentication, really. So I think, and the other point to add is that most of these devices, you have to treat them as untrusted because you don't know what they are. So when I'm accessing my bank account through my banking app, the bank doesn't know where I am. They don't know what device I'm accessing from in some cases as well. So you have to treat that with caution. And of course, with all these opportunities that we as customers have now got, the criminals have got even more opportunities. So SCA really came about to really make sure that we can have the security that we need at the right time. But hopefully, if it's done properly, to make it simple for customers, and that's the trick. The trick is really I think anybody can apply the security, but if it's not usable, and we're talking about using it many times a day now, when we commuting on and off the train, we're on our phones, we're checking bank balances, we're paying someone, we're making constantly using and authenticating ourselves. So it's an attempt, I think, to provide that layer of security, but also let's not forget it needs to be a good customer experience as well. So that's what it's trying to tackle.
We're seeing banks actually move from just offering services to actually becoming a trusted financial, effectively, teacher. Do you think the onus is effectively on the banks then in this ecosystem to inform, educate, and enact these anti-fraud measures?
As we've heard, really, it's everybody's got to play their part. But fundamentally, this has got to start with the banks. The banks have got to create a token for the payer to be able to use that is compliant. And that's one of the key issues. The banks weren't ready. So even this time last year, when folks were just beginning to realize that we were not much more than 100 days out from the implementation deadline, then it looked like banks were ready because they'd done so much in the online banking arena and the app-based banking arena, but had done almost nothing in and around the highly distributed card-based rails into the e-commerce ecosystem. And so even if the banks had been ready, the rest of the ecosystem wasn't going to be. And it turned out that it was really only through the early part of last summer that things started to ramp up. In fact, it was this day a year ago that the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK pulled the key players together to say we need to form a program to effectively run this whole exercise for the industry as a whole. So that was essentially when the thing started properly, just on the final week in April last year.
And so effectively, Andy, then obviously we've heard this kind of idea that maybe the industry is having to now seriously grapple with it, with as with most regulations. But obviously from a tech side and a payment side of things, you touched on it briefly how it's the beginning of something new. It's potentially, if it does finally come to fruition, it leads to something far greater. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do. But the if is a big if, I think. It could equally go badly pear-shaped if it's not done correctly. And I think, I still see some problems with the regulation. For example, how you interpret certain things in the regulation. So, we talk to banks on a daily basis, and we talk to banks who think, for example, using the SMS channel is a tick in the box that will get you through PSD2. And then, you talk to the schemes or other banks who are very clear that this is a weakness that, is a solution that's far better served with, for example, biometrics. And because banks are interpreting in different ways, this is causing all sorts of problems. So there's a real grey area as to what is compliant, what's not compliant. So I think we really have to tackle those problems that are still there, and to me the definitions are still not clear. Certainly on a global level, you get RTSs, regional RTSs, which are really sort of making their positions clear, but there's no overall view, and I think that's a problem. And I think the other problem is consistency of how you apply these things. So again, if I'm a user and when I access my bank I need to use a one-time password dongle, I press a button and enter 6 digits, whereas with this other bank I need to receive an SMS, and with the other bank I use my user ID and password. It becomes a bit of a nightmare for me as a user as well, I think. So yes, it can be a real success, and hopefully it will be, but we need to get some of this grey area clarified, and I'd like to see some consistency in how SCA is used. Paul mentioned 3D Secure version 2. There's a perfect example of how you can wrap biometrics around that to make it way better experience than version 1, where you all have that horrific, trying to remember your password. And in my case, we had a joint account. My wife used to change the password to something she'd remember, and then I couldn't use the bloody thing. So we can do it much better. And yeah, 3DS version 2 is a great example of that. And so I am hopeful we can do it, but we're not there yet, and there's a lot of work to do.
Interesting. And can I ask, I attend a lot of fintech events myself, and a lot of the times I see the technology of biometric data stored on the card. And that's one of those very futuristic fintech ideas you always see, and you think, oh wow, we got that flying car moment when it comes to payments. is that something that could satisfy SCA? And is it something that's even feasible that we might see banks starting to roll out as a result of these grey areas to SCA? Both of you, if you have any input on this.
Well, from a vendor point of view, we get a lot of interest from banks, both around biometrics on cards, which is an interesting idea. As is, for example, dynamic CVV, the idea of being able to rotate your 3 digits, which at the moment are static and written on the back of the card. You can potentially do that on a card, but there are also arguably better ways of doing it by using the mobile as well. So for sure, we will see biometric cards. We're already working on them, and several people are working on them. But they're not going to be mass scale because they're too expensive. You can't get down to the cost of a typical EMV card with all the extra gubbins that go into a DC CVV or a biometric card. But I think you can use the power of the smartphone to do some of those features. So yeah, I mean, we see metal cards, recycled plastic cards, we'll see biometric cards. We will see evolutions in cards, but I think, maybe I'm biased, I'm more of a phone guy. I think the smartphone, let's leverage this power we've got, this superpower we've got in our hands, this massive computing power to do a lot of this for us. But I think the two will go hand in hand for a while, for sure. So
this one regulation, I mean, are there any opportunities, Andy and Paul, for retailers, or is this literally just a negative and just a significant amount of challenges, but challenges that maybe needed to have come through?
No, it's not negative. There are some negative elements, but fundamentally, this is something that was absolutely necessary. It is, frankly, a travesty that it's taken 12, 14 years to lock down fraud in the e-commerce, mobile and remote channels, following our success in that in face-to-face transactions with chip and pin. So the industry should have responded much quicker and in a much more collaborative way. And I would say the card schemes have done a lot of work here with EMVCo particularly, and I'm pleased that we are where we are, because if they'd just been trying to come together now to respond to what the EBA had suggested, we would be looking at many years before we were going to be able to lock down the basic card infrastructure. So there's a lot of upsides in that this is something that we need to do. When we can build more confidence in the citizen consumer community about online payment security, then I think that will help drive even more people in that direction, because there are still plenty of people who are very nervous about using their cards online or in other remote channels. So we do need to keep continually building that confidence. So I think there are real upsides but I do see many of the downsides, as Andy said earlier, in terms of friction. This is undoubtedly going to apply unnecessary levels of friction to the ecosystem, and that will create a negative customer experience until we can get this common, ubiquitous, foundational approach to applying SCA. And that's what some of the SCA programs around Europe are doing. But again, going back to what Andy said earlier, there's little or no consistency across the different countries in Europe in terms of how they're going to apply this. So that has another implication for certain merchant sectors, particularly hospitality, travel, and general cross-border trade. In my mind, to all intents and purposes, the digital single market from a European e-commerce economy is concerned has virtually been killed by the inconsistency that has been applied on this, and the lack of leadership that the European Banking Authority has shown in this regard.
Moving on slightly, we've talked obviously about how the banks are interacting about it. We've just touched on slightly how it might affect the payments and the retail industry. But how do you guys see the fact that it might affect the retail industry, especially when it's, I mean, we can't not talk about Corona at this point. The retail industry is obviously having to find new ways. Has this come at the wrong time? And where do you see the retail industry going in the future, Paul?
So this time last year, we were calling for a managed delay to the 14th of September deadline, mainly because it was quite clear that despite the fact that there were some useful solutions in the background, we couldn't have rolled this out anywhere near the timeline that was available. And so the EBA on the 21st of June last year made one of their first real opinion piece known and started to move this process forward and said that there would be a period of supervisory flexibility. So that was a good first step. But it then took them until the 16th of October last year to make the next opinion available. And so at least by that stage, most national competent authorities had put fairly sensible programs in place, with the UK establishing a new timeline that aimed at the 14th of March 2021, and the EBA coming in on, frankly, what was the most ridiculous cliff edge deadline of the 31st of December 2020, the very day that means that it's going to become effective on the date that most folks around the world are going to be on holiday. And so resilience and backup and so on is just not going to be available. So that was all pre-coronavirus, and programs were well underway. And I sit on the UK Finance Steering Group for FCA in the UK, and that program is very robust, and all stakeholder groups were actively participating in that. But as Andy had said earlier, there are still so many questions. I draw a lot of parallels to the rollout of Chip and Pin, where I sat on the Chip and Pin program management organisation in the UK. But there we had the luxury of having a locked down standard in terms of the early EMV protocols for Chip and Pin. We still don't have that within the RTS for SCA. There are still so many fundamental questions outstanding. So regulatory streams, operational streams, technical streams, communication streams are all ongoing, but without the fundamentals in place of a lockdown standard. So with coronavirus coming on top of that, the complexity of rolling this out on a very diverse ecosystem has just been compounded. Testing and accreditation programs are being delayed. The ability to get access to developers and so on in particularly in Asian markets and so on has been diminished. And so sensibly, I think most national competent authorities are now looking at whether the existing timelines are valid. And I do fully expect to see some delays on that further into 2021.
Incredible. And Andy, and wrapping up for you as well.
So I think we'll definitely, COVID-19 or not, this move online will continue. And I'm not just talking about retailers putting their goods and services online, but that whole payment checkout experience, which is a real bottleneck, I think has to be simplified. We mentioned in-app payments. There's also digital receipts. One of the most frustrating things today is I can pay with most things with my phone, but I still get a paper receipt. And there are companies like Flux doing some great things now, and lots of startups. I'd like to see more of that. Loyalty and rewards. I mean, I've worked in this industry and been part of the, we've tried, and when I was at Proxama, to do more around loyalty and rewards. It's very difficult to do it, but again, a more integrated digital approach there. Using e-com at the point of sale, I think, where you can maybe use QR codes and other ideas to pay account to account. And I think all these things, let's not forget, all this that we're talking about is so that you and I can make a payment as simple as we can. We're really not interested in tokenization and biometrics. These are all friction. These are all problems. And we have to make these layers as thin as possible. So I think there's lots of great stuff coming out of things like PSD2, which help with the APIs, open banking, with the sort of promotion of biometrics. But yeah, I mean, I really echo those points Paul made. We need consistency, because at the moment there are some great solutions, but they're ad hoc, and that's no good. If you want this to be mass consumer related, it needs to be everywhere, and it needs to be consistent. And Paul's example of Chip and Pin is a great one, because we all did the same thing, irrespective of whether it's a Lloyd's card or a Visa card or a Amex card. You put your card in there, you typed your 4 digits, you took your card out, and that's the kind where we need to get to with PSD2. and we're not there yet. But I think the opportunities are there, and the people who grab it with two hands will be the ones that succeed at the end of the day.
Very exciting. Well, guys, thank you so much for your time. And I have interviewed both these gentlemen previously and earlier in the year, so make sure to check out those interviews as well on www.fintech.finance, and also my interview with Dirk Halbrick from the EBA on SCA on the same website. Thank you very much for watching, and catch us next time. Bye.